In July 1946, Louis Réard showcased his new invention on the beaches of southern France, the bikini. This new item of fashion was named after nuclear weapon tests which took place at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This fashion debut took place 4 days after these nuclear tests. The atomic craze surrounding nuclear weapons came after the bombing in Hiroshima. This craze gave rise to atomic-inspired jewelry and cocktails, and the rush of Hollywood filmmakers to include nuclear weapons and warfare into their storyline. The beginning of the atomic era is marked by the U.S. detonation of the first atomic bomb, called the Trinity. This was during World War II. The era is commonly thought as being between 1945 and 1963. The end of the atomic era may be marked by the first international treaty with the attempts to decrease nuclear testing. Between these years, an extraordinary amount of nuclear tests were carried out. These tests were carried out in one of three ways: underground, in the atmosphere, or underwater. Most of the early nuclear tests were detonated in the atmosphere, spreading radioactive debris throughout the air. Since the first explosion on July 16th of 1945, 8 nations have detonated 2,056 nuclear test explosions altogether at numerous testing sites across the globe. The United States alone detonated 1,030 of the 2,056 tests, with Russia detonating the second largest amount at 715 tests. 90% of the nuclear tests carried out took place in the Northern Hemisphere due to the high amount of tests which were carried out by USA, Russia, and China, as well as because of other radioactively polluting incidents in the Northern Hemisphere, such as the nuclear power plant accidents of 1986 and 2011 in Chernobyl and Fukushima Daiichi. These incidents, along with the nuclear tests, have produced a large amount of radioactive isotopes present in our atmosphere. When these nuclear tests are carried out in the atmosphere, as roughly 25% of all tests have been, the explosion has the ability to propel the radioactive material up to 50 miles above the explosion site and into the atmosphere. Although some of the debris falls back to the terrestrial biosphere, the lighter debris and radioactive isotopes will remain in the atmosphere until they are absorbed by the ocean. The ocean has been important in limiting the amount of radioactive isotopes in the atmosphere because it is such a great capacity for absorption. Of course, this is just a shift of the burden of toxic radiation from terrestrial environments onto aquatic environments. Each of the nuclear tests have left behind environments more and more radioactively polluted, to the point where many are socially and ecologically destroyed. These aquatic, atmospheric, and underground environments are polluted at levels which have affected the lives within these environments, human as well as animal and plant life. Most of the testing sites were located in lands of indigenous and minority peoples. In the smaller nuclear-possessing countries, such as France and Britain, the tests nearly always took place in colonized countries. The entire nuclear cycle is coupled with environmental racism. An international network of organizations called Abolition 2000, with the goal of prohibiting and eliminating nuclear weapons, wrote this quote in their 1997 Montreal Declaration. The colonized and indigenous people have in the large part borne the brunt of this nuclear devastation, from the mining of uranium and the testing of nuclear weapons on indigenous peoples' lands, to dumping, storage, and transport of plutonium and nuclear waste, and the theft of land for nuclear infrastructure. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War is a federation of medical groups across the world who have composed many studies on the effects of the health consequences resulting from nuclear tests. The federation won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 for their efforts. One of their studies from 1991 estimated that roughly 2.4 million people could die from cancer as a result of the radiation exposure from the nuclear tests carried out between 1945 and 1980. People who are exposed to radiation are at a higher chance of having and dying from cancer because gamma rays are carcinogens. Radiation can alter the DNA within an exposed human cells, causing mutations within the DNA structure. The damage which radiation causes to a cell occurs in fractions of a second. These mutated cells have developed into cancer over time. For cases of people who have developed cancer after being exposed to radiation, the cancers took between 2 and 20 years to develop on average. The evidence proving that radiation is a carcinogen is based on studies that were done on people exposed to nuclear radiation, such as survivors from Chernobyl, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, as well as uranium miners. Studies conducted by the American Cancer Society concluded that people exposed to radiation had a higher risk of having most types of leukemia, multiple myeloma, lymphoma, and cancers of the thyroid, bladder, breast, lungs, ovaries, colon, esophagus, stomach, liver, and of the skin. According to the study, even people who were exposed to low amounts of radiation had a higher risk of having cancer, and the risk increased immensely for the people who were exposed to nuclear radiation as children. Studies such as these were the basis for heightened concern about the safety of nuclear testing during the 1950s. This public concern for both the degradation of the environment and the impact on human health helped provoke a global ideological shift away from nuclear testing. In 1955, the United Nations Disarmament Commission began speaking with the United States and the Soviet Union in attempts to negotiate a treaty to put an end to the testing of nuclear weapons. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed in Moscow, one day short of the 18th anniversary of the Hiroshima atomic bombing. This treaty demanded a ban on all nuclear testing done in the atmosphere and in aquatic environments. This treaty also included that the states who signed it would work towards eliminating the use of nuclear weapons and complete disarmament. Although this treaty had a major impact on the reduced nuclear pollution of aquatic and atmospheric environments, it failed to reduce underground nuclear testing, as it allowed for it within the treaty. Besides this drawback, France and China refused to sign the treaty and continued testing in all environments. This was just the first pact with the goal of limiting nuclear testing. 30 years after the Limited Test Ban Treaty was put into place, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. This treaty prohibited all testing of nuclear bombs, encompassing even underground tests. Because of this treaty was more of an environmental victory than the previous treaty. The treaty was signed by the President of the United States at the time, Bill Clinton, but unfortunately the Senate did not pass the treaty, as more than half of the Senate opposed it. These votes were largely following party lines. China and the U.S. signed the treaty. Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China all signed and ratified the treaty. The three countries who own nuclear weapons but refuse to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty are India, Pakistan, and North Korea. India and Pakistan's last nuclear tests performed were both in May of 1998, while North Korea performed a test on September 3rd of 2017. This is the most recent nuclear explosion. The atomic era has been considered over ever since the United States and Russia stopped nuclear testing. This halt could have been provoked by the general public, who were rightfully concerned about their health and the health of the environment. Or it could have been provoked by the countries having enough data from their past tests to not need to perform anymore. It is likely a combination of the two. Most of the radiation has been absorbed into the ocean or the terrestrial biosphere by now, so the amount of radiation you are absorbing that originates from a nuclear test is likely very minimal, especially compared to the other sources of radiation we are surrounded by often, such as X-rays and the security detectors at the airport. But as I stated before, the damage which radiation causes to a cell occurs in fractions of a second. So the people who are exposed to radiation during these nuclear tests, predominantly indigenous and minority people, are still bearing the consequences. I would say the most crucial question we should be asking ourselves regarding nuclear testing today is whether the people who are forced to bear the burden of nuclear testing are being compensated, or whether they have been forgotten.